Welcome csc103 class. I'm going to be reviewing our exercise 10b, which is the one where we did a random number if-else conditional statement. And what I'm going to do, instead of doing this all from scratch, which I don't really need to do, I'm going to go into my dashboard and I'm just going to open up a finished version and just kind of review that. I think that'll be easier than going through the entire thing from scratch, because you're actually going to be opening up 10a and working with that and just making revisions to it. So there shouldn't be a lot of code to do, so there's no reason for me to go through and do all that code. So I'm going to open up my 10b that's already finished. I could show you how it functions, and then I could just show you the code, and that you should be fine going through that yourself and making changes yourself from your 10a if you did your 10a random number. Again, it's still displaying a random number. What we're going to do here is just actually display different versions or different messages based on whatever number comes up. And I just kind of made just a little example where if you got above 5, it shows a message. If you go below 5, it shows a message. And if you get exactly 5, it shows a message, just to show how an if-else conditional statement works. And also, one thing to point out, and I make this mistake sometimes, we call them if-else statements. It's really a conditional statement. And if-else is usually a pair that goes together. There's usually an if statement and an else statement. And there's also one called an else-if. But sometimes when I see these written together, I write the one as if-else. So just be careful that, remember, it's else-if, the middle one that follows the if. But as a pair, they're called if-else statements or conditional statements, meaning there's some condition that has to be followed in order for something to happen. But anyway, before we do that, let's take a look at our HTML of what we have here. It's very similar to the 10a. You're going to change your headline here. It's going to be just, you could call it just 10b random number. I'm putting 10b here because it's just easier to locate in my dashboard when I look at all my little thumbnails. So you're going to have your H1, you're going to have a paragraph that's just going to give some instruction, whatever you want to put here. Click the button to generate a random number from 1 through 10 is fine, the same that we had last time. And you could keep the function name the same. Just remember, it should be the same down in your JavaScript code. But up here in your HTML, it should be called display number. If you're going to use camel case with a capital N, make sure you do that down there as well. So that's going to be on the button on click. We just have one button. And then we'll have two areas that will display information. Now, these could be both H2s. One could be an H2 and an H3. I think that's the way I had it in the instructions, but here I'm putting an H2 and an H1. It doesn't matter that much. I put in an H1. That way the message could be displayed bigger. But it doesn't matter what you use. H2s, H3s, whatever you use. So if you want them bigger, just go use H1 or something like that. And also what we're going to do is change the color. So let me just show you the finished version here. We're going to hit the button that displays a number. It'll do two things. In the H2 that I have here, that with the ID of number, it displays the number, and it came up with a number 8, which is above 5. So if it's above 5, it says great job. If it's 5, it says just okay, and it's colored blue. If it's below 5, it says some kind of negative message here. I just used you stink in class, but you could say not good or you lose, whatever you want. We just wanted something negative, and it also changed to a red color. So we're just giving kind of a positive, negative, and in between kind of message there, along based on the number that shows up. So that's going to be a conditional statement that'll determine if it's above 5, below 5, or equal to 5. And then we'll also determine if we're going to color it a certain way as well. So that's all part of the JavaScript. So again, there's two areas here that are going to match up, where the number is displayed and where the message is displayed. So you could call them number and message. It's easy enough. You shouldn't have to do anything with the CSS, I don't believe, so we could just skip that. That should be the same as your other one, your 10a. And the way we started off this assignment is we created 3 variables right here that represent our messages. And you don't have to do that, but the reason we did that, because it's easier to put the variable, output the variable as a statement rather than outputting a whole string of text down here. So it just makes these lines really long. So we're just going to stick in a variable there, or input a variable. So we're going to call the 3 variables. These are going to be the names with the variable keywords: win, lose, and tie. And we're going to assign them a value, and in this case they'll be strings or text. And the first one is going to say great job. The lose one could say you stink, or you know, something negative, or bad job, or whatever you want to say. I'll just leave it as you stink. And the other one, we'll just call it a tie. It's kind of in between. Now, it would have been better if I could have done grades or something, and you know, if you had above 90, it was an A or something else, or it was a B or whatever. But I just wanted to show 3 conditions because we're going to use 3 conditions when we do our rock, paper, scissors exercise after this. So those are going to be our 3 variables. Great job, you stink, just okay. And we'll call them win, lose, or tie. So when it comes time to output them, we'll just output the variable, not the actual line of text. And for our function, we're going to keep it the same name function that you use for 10a, display number, because that's what we're doing. We're displaying a number here. And you're going to have the same math random method. You could have the same editing of it that multiplies it by 10. And then we'll have the same math.ceal, which rounds it up so that we get 1 through 10. And then what happens right after that is it outputs the number. And notice we're outputting the number before we get to the conditional statement. And I'll show you that in just a second, but here's where we output the number. That's the first thing that's going to happen. It's going to output the number right here. And then for the rest of this, I'll move this over so we can see these lines. And I did put extra space in between these just to make it easier to follow. And I would recommend doing that too. And I'd also recommend keeping the opening bracket up here and the closing bracket down there. It's easier to kind of match them up because we're going to have a lot more brackets. Notice that in our function, we have an opening bracket up here. There's our opening bracket for the entire function, and the closing bracket is way down here. So notice there's 2 here. That's because this is the closing to this else kind of grouping here, where there's actually 2 statements inside. And notice there's an opening and closing bracket for else if, and there's an opening and closing bracket for if. So there's actually 3 pairs of brackets that are inside the actual function. So altogether, the function will have 8 brackets. So you got to be careful with that. So be very clear about how you have this written so that you can keep track of them. So if you see these 2 at the end, this is the way it should be. And when you get that little red arrow there, it's going to be because you don't have one of these. You know, if you're getting some kind of message where you're getting this thing here and you're getting unexpected end of input, it's because you're probably missing one of these. So you really got to check your brackets and make sure that they match up. So open and closing brackets for the entire function of display number, and then separate pairs of brackets for the if, the else if, and the else. All right, so I'm going to go through this really quickly just to show you what the if, the else if, and the else does. So I'm just going to explain it. I don't have to type it all out or anything. But what happens here in these conditional statements is we use the keyword if, and then in parentheses we put our condition. And our condition is going to be if random number, that's the one we're generating from 1 through 10, if it's greater than 5, there's a greater than symbol. And then we basically have to use opening and closing curly brackets. We put in statements that indicate what's going to happen if that condition is met. So when this function runs, it's going to come down here, it's going to generate a random number, it's going to display a random number, then it's going to come here and say, okay, is that random number greater than 5? And if it is, then it's going to display the win message. That's what we have right here. This document get element by ID message in the message area. Make sure you're putting in the message area, not the number area. The number area, this is the number area, and this is the message area. So in the message area, it's going to display inner HTML equals win, and win is great job. So it's just the variable representing the string that's going to display. So for greater than 5, it's going to input win, which is great job. And then down here, don't worry about the color yet. The next one we're going to do. Now, typically, sometimes you could have an if and then have an else, meaning if it's not one thing, it's going to be something else. Well, in this case, we're putting a second condition. And instead of just putting another if, we're going to do something called else if. It just kind of indicates that it's another condition after the first one. And this condition, when it says else if, 2 words, it says random is less than 5. And if it's less than 5, it displays a message called lose, which is the one that says you stink. So if I display 3, it's going to say you stink because it's less than 5. So what's going to happen, again, it's going to run down this function, it's going to display a number, and if this condition is not met, if it's not greater than 5, it's going to move along and it's going to say, is it less than 5? And if it is, it's going to display the lose message. And if it's not either of those, it's going to move along. And now we don't have to put another condition here with else. Else just means it doesn't meet this condition or that condition. So else does not have a condition. It will not have anything in parentheses. It'll just say else, and then basically it means if it's not this one or that one. It's any other option, which in this case, the only option is 5. So eventually when we click here, one of the options is going to be 5. There's the 5 option, and you can see it outputs in blue. Now these colors, we added another statement here, and instead of displaying a message like we did, here it says tie, it displays tie. So it displays win, lose, or tie based on what the number is. And if it's not greater than or less than 5, it has to be equal than 5, and it says tie. And it displays tie, which is just okay. That's what we put for that. But then also we gave it a special color. And for each one, the color we gave it a whole document get element by ID message, and we used .style.color. If you remember from the Patrick one, we did style.opacity. In this one, we're doing style.color, and then in quotes, we're putting a hex number. And if you know your hex numbers, you know that the first 2 is R, red, the next 2 is G, green, and the next 2 are blue. So we kind of made this one an FF and then went down a little bit. Remember going down from F, and made it a little bit of a darker green. So this one's the green because it has the letters in the middle. This one's red because it has FF, the first 2 letters, which makes it a regular RGB red. And this one has FF as the last 2 digits of our hex number because that's the B part, and all the other ones are 0. RGB is fine for using that. We just made our green a little darker, but you could keep it the bright green as well. You could just use, if you had FF here, that's fine. So that's just another statement that's just changing the color by using .style.color, which is basically targeting the CSS style and applying that kind of as an inline style, because it's not a style that we're actually finding from our CSS because we didn't give it any colors in our CSS, but it's using these properties and it's basically assigning it through this statement. So 2 statements, one that's basically outputting inner HTML, which is outputting text in an area, and another statement which is outputting color, and it's saying apply that color to the same text that's in that message ID. And again, this line here is the number ID, and that was taken care of when we had this statement up here. So remember, this statement can be outside of those if-else statements. It displays the number first, and then the conditions determine based on that number if they're above 5, below 5, or equal to 5, and they change colors. So that's what really happens. Just make sure that you have 8 brackets altogether for this function. Make sure that you have your function's display number matches up with the function name in here. So you got to make sure that display number and display number is exactly the same. And you also have to remember that your number should be the same as these. So the number up here should be what you're indicating down here. So double check, make sure it's not display or something else from the older assignment. Make sure that you're matching up message and message. Make sure you're matching up number and number. And then also if you're using ran number or if you're using rand number with a D, make sure they all match up too. Make sure all these say ran number all the way through, even to here. So that's all you got to do. And then make sure that you save it as 10b, call it JS-RandomNum-10b-If-Else. If-else is basically just, kind of what represents conditional statements. That's what we're doing here. We're setting up conditions, 3 separate conditions, if, else, if, and an else. And if all those conditions are met, something will happen based on that. So that's all you have to do for that. So make sure you save that with your name. You can put your section on there. But remember, for most of you, I can get into your CodePen to read it, so that's not a big deal. And that's about it. So this will be a little lead-in to our rock, paper, scissors exercise, which will be 10C, which will follow this one. And you will be able to use, or at least start with this code when you start in the rock, paper, scissors.